Hi everybody, welcome to International Studies 2 and welcome to your first online lecture, week 1, Introduction to Globalization. My name is Diana, or Diana, whichever you prefer, and I'm going to be your lecturer for this unit. For those of you who didn't join the Zoom call yesterday morning, just a quick introduction so you know who's behind the voice. I'm originally from Switzerland, so that's why the accent. I have a bachelor's in communication, a master's in international studies from University of Barcelona in Spain, and I've mostly been working in project development, project management for different nonprofits, but also for the United Nations in different countries around the world. And I'm here in South Africa since about 5 years. I've been teaching this unit for 3 years now at IIE MSA. So as you can see, I really enjoy it. I think it's a really nice unit because it's very broad. I think it gives you background knowledge to a lot of things that help you sort of understand what's going on in our world nowadays more in detail and with more background. If you're curious about the schedule of the unit, please have a look at the introductory session, the PowerPoint. There you will see the topic of each week and also the different assessments. So you just make sure you do check that. It is, as I said, it is quite a broad unit. So we'll look at economic globalization, at political globalization, cultural, and then we'll also look at specific topics that are very closely linked or impacted by globalization, like the environment, international crime, migration. We'll look at the role of China in nowadays world. So there's a lot of topics that are very concrete and that link to a lot that you see in the news. So yeah, let's get started with today's lecture. Just in general as well, for those who were not on the Zoom call yesterday, because we will be working online, at least for now, maybe even the whole semester, you will basically always find an online lecture like this that is recorded every Thursday, which will probably last about 1.5 hours. And after that, you still have time to do an activity. The activity is either going to be at the end of this video, or it's going to be in a separate video, or it's going to be as a forum activity. So this will vary a bit depending on the week, depending on the activity. And then every Wednesday morning from 8 till 9, we have time for a Zoom call to do question and answers. It's literally for you to also discuss in groups, to bring in your own ideas, your input. You might have your own stories that relate to the topics that we're treating. So please join those Zoom calls. Also, because this is all online, I know sometimes it's difficult to keep up in terms of discipline because you're like, yeah, I can also watch it tomorrow or next week. There's no real time pressure. There is a real danger in that, which is that you're going to fall behind and that you're eventually going to have way too many things piled up. So try to really listen to the lecture every week. Try to stay on top of things. Try to really stay on top of your schedule so that you don't fall behind. This just as a recommendation. And now we're really going to get started. Just some admin to start with. All the content will be available on Learn or on Moodle if you're still Monash students. So just make sure you check. You're going to find everything every week there. I'm going to upload the lecture just with slides, and I'm also going to upload the link so that you can listen to it. So you will have both. As I said, for the unit structure, check the PowerPoint called Introductory Session under week 1. You're going to have your first assignment due in week 5. The exact date and time are still to be confirmed, but just remember week 5 is coming quite soon, right? So that's why it's important that you stay up to date. It's going to be a sort of a take-home test about the content of week 1 to 4. But you're going to receive more information a bit closer to the date. As I said, the Q&A session on Wednesday from 8 till 9. The consultation time is going to be right after, also on Zoom. if you want an individual consultation time, let me know via email so that I can schedule you guys so that we don't have 20 people or even 5 people on at the same time. Regarding your textbook, most of the lecture is based on this textbook. It's called Globalization, a Basic Text, second edition by George Ritzer and Paul Dean. It's a really great book. It gives you a great overview. It gives great examples. I think especially if you're really studying international studies, this is a great book to have. So I would highly recommend that you buy it. Make sure that you get the second edition. And as I said, a lot of this unit will be based on that textbook. There are some additional readings in some of the weeks. You'll find them on Learn and on Moodle as well. And as I said, it is your responsibility to manage your time responsibly and to be up to date with the weekly online lectures and activities. Okay, so today's session, don't worry if today's session is a bit more theoretical. The other sessions will be very practical and related to a lot of current topics. This one, because it is the first one, we need to sort of look at the core concepts so that we can then build on it. So it's basically a bit of the theoretical foundations. So we're going to start by defining globalization, looking at what is globalization, how has it been defined. We'll specifically look at global flows and barriers. You will see what that is, but it's one of the core concepts in globalization. We will look at the origins of globalization and at what have been the driving forces. We'll also specifically look at what is globalization from above and what is globalization from below, and to what extent are they clashing forces, sort of. We will look at criticisms to globalization from different parts of academia. And we'll also have a very quick look at globalization and at related processes that have sort of been linked or that have been driving globalization as well. And as I said, you're going to have a week 1 activity, which is going to be a political orientation quiz to do after this lecture. It's going to be in a separate video on Learn/Moodle, so you'll find it there. Okay, so now looking at globalization, I want to start with a quick quiz just for you to sort of get a grasp of what we're talking about. This is from the DHL Global Connectedness Index 2012, so it's a bit older. So obviously the numbers will be a bit higher now, 8 years later. But I just want you to ask yourself, how big of a percentage of posts do you think is currently sent internationally? Grab a piece of paper, write it down for yourself so that you can compare. What percentage of phone calls do you think are international phone calls? What percentage of Facebook friends do you think live in different countries? What percentage of news comes from foreign websites? How much percentage of global GDP do you think export and imports make up, roughly? And how many percentage of people do you think live outside the country they were born in? These are all sort of factors that would give us an idea of globalization, right? That's why we're starting with this. And I think you're going to be surprised by the numbers. In 2012, only 1% of posts was sent internationally. Only 5% of phone calls were international. Only 15% of Facebook friends lived in different countries. Only 10% of news came from foreign websites. Only 20% of global GDP was export and imports, and only 3% of people lived outside the country they were born in. So when we talk about globalization, we have to keep this in mind, right? Not everything in the world is globalized. Not everybody is globalized. Not every area of this world is as connected as we might think, especially being here in Johannesburg, in such a big city that is very connected with the world. It's easy to think that everybody is globalized and connected, but there are still vast areas of this world in many countries that are not actually as connected as we might think. So this just as a starter. Now, if we look at globalization, this is sort of the definition that your book will give you, right? And it sounds a bit complicated, but it's actually not. We're going to break it apart a bit so that we're sure that you understand it. So what it says is that globalization is the transplanetary process involving increasing liquidity and growing multidirectional flows of people, objects, places, and information, as well as the structures they encounter and create that are barriers to those flows. Now, this sounds very complicated, but it's actually not, and you'll see that you'll understand it. And actually, the picture below pretty much shows what we're talking about. So there's three concepts that I want to look at, right? Transplanetary process makes sense, right? It's a global process now that involves the liquidity. Now, we're first going to look at what liquidity means. Now, this is basically a theoretical framework that has been used by academics, by researchers, to define how globalization works, right? And it's very easy. Like, you can literally think of water, right? We mostly know water in its liquid form, but as we all know, you can also freeze water and then it's solid, it's ice. Or when you boil it, you can evaporate it and then it becomes gaseous, right? Now, basically, globalization has been looked at through the same frame of liquidity, right? And the idea is that the world has been moving from being very solid to becoming more and more liquid to becoming almost gaseous, right? Now, and this refers to people, things, information, and places, right? Now, if you think about this in a very practical manner, 300 years ago, people, things, information, places did not move much, right? They were basically where they were. Like, people would often be born in a village, they would work in that village, get married in that village, and probably die in that same village, or maybe in the village next to it, right? But they wouldn't move much. The same with things. Most people would consume things that were produced right there in the area and that didn't come from another country or from another continent. And the same with information. Information would mostly move between close by villages. Maybe there would be some information coming from the capital city, but that would pretty much be it, right? So back in the days, the world was basically much more solid. And then with globalization, it became increasingly more mobile, right? There was more and more mobility, more and more movement of people. People started going on ships, people started taking planes. We started having more and more communication technology, and things started moving much, much faster, right? And nowadays we're in a world where we can almost say that we're in a gaseous state, where we have a hypermobility of people, of things, of information. If you think about it nowadays, you can go onto WhatsApp video call, and you can talk with someone on the other side of the world in real time. You can see them, you can hear them. You can send them a selfie and they have it within seconds, right? Or there can be an explosion in Beirut, in Lebanon, and within minutes, here in South Africa, we hear about it in the news, we read it on social media. If you compare that with 100, 200, 300 years ago, that's a massive change, right? That has come with globalization. So basically, this is really what we talk about when we talk about the liquidity and the increasing liquidity of flows, right? Now, another key concept in the definition of globalization and in how we understand globalization is that of flows, right? And now flows is literally the movement of people, of things, of information, even of places, and even of decisions. Mainly due to the fact that there are less barriers, right? There's more porosity, more permeability of global barriers. So for example, the picture that you can see here is a picture of the tourism flows. So you can see the main flows of tourism from which area of the world to which area of the world they go, right? And like this, you can represent pretty much any flow. You can represent the flow of cotton, you can represent the flow of people, the flow of any good, right? Pretty much, or of any person, of any, even of informations, can be represented like this. So this is pretty much what flows are, right? Now, quick questions for you. We can also discuss them in the Q&A on Zoom next week. Can you think of examples for flows of people, flows of things, flows of information, and even flows of places? We will discuss this. The second question, is liquidity the same for everybody? So is everybody as mobile as others? Or are some people, things, informations, and places more liquid or mobile than others? And who decides that? These are really important questions, right? And the third one, what are benefits of increasing global flows and what can be potential dangers? Now I'm going to give you some of the answers now, but as I said, we're going to discuss this as well because many brains always come up with more. Flows of people, I think, is quite an obvious one, right? The first that we probably think of is migration, is people who migrate to another country. However, flows of people can also be tourists. It can also be people who have been trafficked. So it can also be human trafficked people. So there's a lot of different flows of people as well. And even if we look at migration, we will see that in week 6, I think. There's also different types of migration, right? Flows of things is pretty much anything that we trade. So that's pretty much, if you look around you, pretty much everything that you own has probably come from somewhere else and has either been shipped or flown or whatever to you. So those are very, very big flows. Flows of information is obviously what we read in the news. It's social media. Nowadays, it's also fake news, right? It can also be flows of decisions, right? There's decisions, particularly if taken by leaders of very important countries, that can have an impact on a lot of other countries. Particularly, let's say if a country, an important country, steps out of an international agreement. That's a decision that will have a ripple effect on a lot of other countries or on the whole world. So that's sort of a flow as well, right, of a decision. And then the last one, flows of places, is a bit less obvious, but it's basically the idea that a lot of places have been sort of copied, right, or replicated in other places of the world. So for example, you find a Chinatown in a lot of different cities around the world outside of China. You'll find a McDonald's in pretty much every city around the world. So that's things that have been replicated or copied that are also part of global flows and of globalization. Now, question 2, is liquidity the same for everybody, or are some people, things, and information more liquid than others, and who decides that? Now, the obvious answer is no, right? We're not mobile to the same extent, and there's a lot of factors that can influence. For example, in terms of people, let's talk about, for example, tourism. Are we all equally access to be tourists? No, we're not. If you're rich, it's much easier for you to travel than if you're poor, for example. If you're white, you're very likely to receive visas, entry visas into other countries easier than if you're black. If you're a woman, you're probably there's gonna be places where you're gonna be in danger where you won't be able to travel by yourself. While if you're a man, you might be more mobile to do that, right? So there's some sort of natural limitations, right, that affect how liquid or how mobile we can be. It's the same with things. It's the same with information, right? Let's say you grow up in a rural area with very limited to no access to internet. You're going to have very limited access to information or even to things because you're not going to be able to access online education. You're not going to be able to access information, online jobs. So your mobility in terms of how globalized you as a person can be, or even how globalized your area can be very different, and it's influenced by a lot of different factors, right? And those factors is what we'll look at, what we basically call structures or barriers. Now, what are benefits and what are dangers of increasing global flows? This is literally asking ourselves what are benefits of globalization and what are dangers. And it's probably going to take us the whole semester to answer this, but I'm sure you can think of some already. One of the benefits is definitely that there's much more exchange of knowledge. If there's an invention made in one side of the world, we can benefit from it on the other side as well. There's more intercultural understanding to a certain degree, hopefully. There's more there's medication that can travel the world. There's experts that can travel the world, or that can work together globally. So those are definitely benefits. Also the fact that we can consume pretty much anything. I mean, you would not have your mobile phone if it wasn't shipped from probably China. So also having access to all those goods is only possible due to global flows. Dangers, I mean, some of the most obvious, obviously environmental damage. Right now, I think Corona is a very good example of a danger that obviously back in the days, something like Corona would have traveled much less and much less fast. And now it's something that we see all over the world, and that has spread because of globalization. But there's also just the dangers of pollution, the danger of human trafficking, for example, of international crime. So there's a lot of negatives that come with globalization as well, and that have been increased, right? The benefits have sort of been increased and globalized, but the dangers as well. So this is just a very quick answer for this. There's obviously many more examples, so you can give these questions more time if you want to as well. Now, moving to structures and barriers. This is basically the counterpart to the flows, right? And if you go back to the initial definition of globalization, it says that globalization was the increasing liquidity of flows and of the barriers that they encounter. So basically, barriers are what counterbalances the flows. Some of these barriers or structures have been in place since forever, and some of them are new ones, right? And you can really imagine globalization as this play of flows and structures sort of balancing each other out, right? Now, if you have to think of examples of ongoing structures and barriers, these are structures and barriers that have been in place since back in the days, right? And that are still in place. So these can be natural barriers like mountains, like rivers that sort of make crossing physically difficult. They're still in place, right? And funny enough, if you look at countries that have barriers, that have borders that have resulted out of wars or out of conflict, most of those borders go along rivers, go along mountain chains. So they follow natural barriers that were already there as a protection, right? But then we also have borders. We have border policies that are structures, right, that limit the flow of people to a certain extent, right? I mean, if we had no borders and no border policies, we would just come in and out and travel and move the way we wanted, right? So that flow of people is limited by the borders and by border policies and by visa requirements and all of that. In terms of goods, in terms of things, there's a lot of trade agreements, trade tariffs that are in place that also limit how much can be imported, how much can be exported, what additional tariffs and taxes are put on top, right? And these are usually ways in which a country tries to control the flow of things, right? Maybe South Africa doesn't want tons of Brazilian chicken to be imported into South Africa because we have our own chicken here. So what the South African state will do is to put trade tariffs on those Brazilian chicken so that they become more expensive on the local market. So that's a way of limiting that flow of Brazilian chicken, right? This is just an example. Same with monetary unions, right? For example, the fact that the European Union has the euro is something that it has sort of increased the flow of money within the European Union, but it also has created barriers towards the outside, right? Because you have a new not new currency anymore, but it used to be a new one that has to be exchanged, right? And you have different exchange rates. Now, newer structures or barriers are mostly digital ones, right? For example, the digital divide, the fact that some parts of this world have access to digital, to whatever is online, and other people don't, creates a massive divide, right? That is a structure, it is a barrier to the mobility of people who are on the downside of the digital divide. You also have internet controls, for example. China has been in the news a lot for controlling their internet. That's also structure. It's a barrier, right, that the government puts in place because they don't want their own people to access any type of information. You have international banking fees, for example, that also make it more difficult to make international transactions. You have more recent immigration laws that make it harder for people to move. So there's a lot of different type of barriers, right? So literally anything that tries to stop or to limit a certain flow is a barrier. Now, an important question is who regulates flows and structures, right? Flows usually occur quite naturally because, for example, the flow of people, usually migration will happen towards jobs, towards opportunities. So that's something that will happen quite naturally. Structures are usually put in place by governments, by institutions. It can be infrastructure as well. So there's different ways in which countries, institutions, and other mechanisms can be put in place in order to regulate certain flows. Now, questions again, and this, if you can answer this, you really understood the concept of flows and barriers, right? If you have to think of the following actors, these are all actors that are active in our global world, right? Nation states, which means countries. We have multinational corporate companies. We have international organizations, which we'll learn more about when we do economic globalization. We have human rights organizations. We have local labor unions. These are just some examples of actors, right? Now, all of these actors will try to influence or to control flows in one way or another. And usually they obviously do that in accordance with their own interest, right? So basically, to answer this, you can really ask yourself, what is the interest of a nation state? What is the interest of a multinational company? And if that is the interest, what does that mean in how they're going to try to influence or control flows? Now, if we look at nation states, that's countries, right? A country's number one interest is usually their own people, or at least it should be their own people, right? Or their own well-being as a country, right? So what they will do is they're going to try control or influence flows for their own benefit. So for example, they're going to have immigration policies that will limit the immigration of people from other countries to a certain degree, because they're going to want to prioritize giving their own national jobs instead of giving jobs to foreign people coming into the country, right? That's one way. Another way would be to have tariffs, right, on imports, so that your own markets don't get overflown with imported products that might destroy your own markets, right? The example of the chicken that we had. So these are examples of nation states, right? A nation state is also going to try control its own resources to the best possible degree that it can, right? So these are all flows that the nation state will try to control. Now, multinational corporate companies, on the other hand, multinationals are companies that are based in many countries. Usually, they obviously benefit from free flows, right? They want to be able to get the best experts from all around the world. They want to be able to get resources from the countries where the resources are and ship them to the country where they have the lowest manufacturing costs. They want to be able to get workforce in from other countries. So usually multinational corporate companies rather benefit from very free flows of people, free flows of money as well, free flows of good. So they will try influence and rather try to achieve a reduction of barriers, right? And you can already see there's a conflict. There can be a conflict between the interests of nation states and between the interests of multinationals, right? Because there will be areas where a nation state will want to control flows where the multinational corporation doesn't want to. International organizations, likewise, they will try to influence flows in accordance with their interest, right? So a World Trade Organization will try to liberalize trade more, particularly because it is dominated by countries that want that. Other international organizations will have different interests, right, depending on their mission. Same with human rights organization, right? Depending on what they work for, they're gonna want to rather control flows or rather liberalize them. A human rights organization, for example, that helps refugees is gonna try fight for less barriers, for more free flow of people. A human rights organization that fights human trafficking, for example, is going to rather fight the flow of trafficked humans. So it is rather going to fight to have more structures in place that limit the trafficking of humans, right? And local labor unions will probably want to protect the workforce, the local workforce. So they're probably going to rather want to limit immigration in order to save local jobs, right? So these are just a few ways to analyze, and you can see that as soon as we look at different actors, it gets more complicated because everybody has their own interest. And that's why there is this play of flows and barriers, because there's a lot of different actors that have very different interests in what flows freely and what is more controlled. Now, when we look at structures or barriers, there's additional sort of softer, less visible structures and barriers that we also need to look at because they have a very big influence. And we call them social structures or barriers, right? Now, what do we think of when we talk about social structures or barriers? We're basically looking at characteristics like your gender, your race, your ethnicity, your religion, your socioeconomic status, also your health, so disability or ability, your sexual orientation, etc., that can prevent or limit an individual or a group from accessing certain opportunities or resources, right? And therefore limit them from sort of being more globalized and having a better access to the opportunities and resources that globalization can provide. So social structures are often used to differentiate, to subordinate, to oppress, right? I mean, we all know about that. And therefore they affect the flow of people and of things and of information, right? I'm sure you can think of examples of social barriers, right? And how they affect an individual or a group of people. An example we mentioned before is, for example, that it's probably easier for you if you're white to get a visa permit for another country. As a man, you're safer moving around, traveling around. But also in terms of religion, for example, we're seeing that it's much more difficult for Muslim people currently to get access, to be able to travel, to be able to move, to get access to other countries. Socioeconomic status is obviously a very big one. The more money you have, the easier it will be for you to access opportunities. But also ability and disability is a big one, right? We often forget about people with disability, and a lot of places in this world have not been designed to cater for people with disability, which is a massive social structure or barrier for those people. Same when we look at the whole LGBTQI movement, right? A lot of those people are still facing discrimination, are still facing oppression, which makes it harder for them to access certain jobs, access certain opportunities. And you see a lot of movements around the world, current movements like the Black Lives Matter movement, like the LGBTQI demonstrations around the world. Those are movements that are fighting against these social structures and barriers because they limit individuals and groups from having certain opportunities, and they discriminate. So these are really important structures that are less visible than a border or than a mountain or than a river, but that are just as important when we look at the flow of people and of things. So this is really important to keep in mind as well. And this links us to another concept which you might have heard from social studies, which is the intersectionality of social structures. Now, the intersectionality is basically the overlap of social structures that discriminate, right? So for example, a black woman from a rural area, right? She's gonna be discriminated in terms of her race, so she's gonna have less opportunities because of her race, but she's also gonna have less opportunities because of her gender, and she's gonna have less opportunities because she comes from a rural area and she might have less access to opportunities. So those three social structures overlap and create a whole other level of discrimination, right? And of difficulty to access opportunities and resources and to be part of global flows. So here you just see five sort of layers of discrimination or of social structures, but there's many more, right? And intersectionality is an important concept because it looks at how these social structures overlap and how the overlap can sometimes create even more difficulty than just a simple add up, right? So it makes the complexity of our world, right? And I'm sure you can come up with a lot of examples. On the complete opposite end of intersectionality, you would have a white male from a Western country, from a rich background, that has no disability and whose sexual orientation is straight, right? There you would have a human being that is pretty much not discriminated in any way and that does not face any social structures at all, right? And it explains to a certain degree why we see white nationalism in the USA, for example, fighting the Black Lives Matter movement to such a degree, because it's often people who have not experienced social structures themselves and sometimes don't see them or don't want to see them, right? So you can analyze quite a lot of what is going on socially right now in the world through this lens with the intersectionality of social structures. Okay, so now concluding this first part of globalization, right? We're seeing that globalization is increasingly omnipresent, right? And that most of our everyday lives are deeply affected by it. You can probably not get up without already consuming something that has somehow been brought to you by globalization, right? Your coffee is not from South Africa. The clothes that you're putting on are not. Your phone is not. So it's literally everywhere, right? The information is not. Your Instagram is not. So pretty much everything that we consume nowadays has some aspect of globalization in it. We also saw that the contemporary global age is increasingly fluid. So there's more and more flows and faster flows of things. Coronavirus has put a bit of a halt on these flows, or on some of them, but it's a temporary halt, right? We all know that we will, at least to some degree, go back to our very fast globalized world. There is also an ongoing relationship between global flows and structures that influence each other constantly. That's one of the main concepts of globalization. And we've also seen that all different global and also local actors constantly try to influence flows and structures to their benefit. So these are really some of the core sort of things that you should remember from this first part of the lecture. Now we have sort of looked at what globalization is. Now it's important to look at where the origins of globalization lie, because this also helps us to understand globalization better and to also maybe have a better understanding of where it is leading us. So there's a lot of different theories about the origins of globalization. So there's a lot of different academics that have come up with different theories. They all have their justifications, and you can read up more on them in your book and also in the online articles. For example, Chanda argues that globalization is a basic human urge to seek a better life. So because of this urge to seek a better life, we have started moving more and more, trading more and more, and that's sort of how globalization got started, right? That's sort of Chanda's argument. You have Scholte, who rather argues that globalization is a cycle, where you sort of go through global ages, and he sort of just says that each cycle is more globalized but has similar patterns. You have Peterse, for example. He argues that there are 6 epochs of globalization that start as far back as 3000 before Christ. So that's another theory. You have another theory that sort of looks at globalization originating in specific events, also as far back as the conquest of the Roman Empire. You have another theory, which you also find in your book, that says that globalization originated in 3 big changes. One, the emergence of the US as a global power after World War II. The second one, the emergence of multinational corporations as an international player, and the fall of the Soviet Union, which sort of eliminated communism and socialism as a type of structure or of organization of society, and therefore sort of paved the way for a neoliberal society that was driven by the US. So this is another theory. The last theory, and this is the one that we're going to be looking at, is that globalization originated with the nation state, with merchant empires, and with capitalism. This theory comes from Metzlisch, and you find a whole article on it on Learn/Moodle under week 1 if you want to read more about it. But we'll go straight into it. We're going to look at that one because it's a very convincing one, basically. Because it looks at aspects that have had a very big impact on how globalization has worked. So therefore we focus on that one. So basically what Metzlisch argues is that globalization started with the birth of the nation state. And now this is something that sometimes we forget about, right? Because we've all been born and we've all grown up in a world that is divided into countries, and you have a nationality, you're from a specific country, and that's how it is, right? But that's not how the world has always functioned. And actually, we only have to go back 500 years in time, and the world didn't have countries. The world had kingdoms and different types of sort of conglomerates. It had areas, it had empires. Like, there were a lot of different structures, right? And that sort of cohabited or sometimes fought each other. And it was only in 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia, and this is really important. This treaty basically established the modern state, right? Now this was in Europe after a period of a lot of wars, where all the different European, by then not really countries, but areas or kingdoms, were fighting each other, and sort of came to realize that this was not really beneficial for anyone. And so in 1648, they sat down and they signed the Treaty of Westphalia. And basically with this treaty, they agreed that each country had a sovereign territory, and that this meant that in that territory, that country ruled, and you could not just invade, or if you wanted to invade, you had to declare war. But basically, the countries sort of agreed of recognizing each other's territory, and recognizing that whichever state was in that territory had the right to decide what to do with that territory. So this is this notion of sovereignty and of sovereign territory, which is very important. This also meant that the European state, or this was sort of one of the reasons why they also established a treaty, right? The European states also realized that they actually needed more efficient tax systems, that they needed more resources in order to be stronger, right? Because although they had signed a treaty, they were still in competition with each other, right? And this is pretty much how colonialism started, right? It started with European states feeling that they needed to be more powerful, that they needed to have more resources, more money, and sending out explorers around the world, colonizing those parts of the world. and eventually starting to fight global wars against each other as early as 1701 already, right? Which is what we know as the colonization period. And now this is important because previous to this, you didn't have that model all over the world, right? So it was because countries started sending out explorers, and then this came jointly with the development of sailing ships, of astronomy, of mapping, of navigation. All of this allowed those European powers to travel around the world. And some of those European powers really became merchant empires, particularly the British, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese. So they were pretty much ocean-based empires that made profit based on that, right? They would literally go around the world, explore, colonize, and bring back all the resources. Without going more into detail, because I'm sure you know the history or the historic parts, what we want to look at is what effects did the Treaty of Westphalia and did the merchant empires and the colonization have on the world, because this pretty much laid the ground for globalization. Now, one important outcome was that the entire world increasingly became structured into nation states, right? Because you had these European states that now functioned in a way almost like they function today as nation states, and they went out and colonized the world and increasingly started structuring the world into nation states as well, right? And we see this nowadays on the African continent, where a lot of borders were simply drawn by the colonial powers and are a simple straight line on a map that completely cuts across ethnicities, that cuts across natural barriers, and that doesn't make sense, that make it very difficult for countries to be governable nowadays, right? But this is something that originated back then and had a massive impact on how the world looks today. Another outcome was that there was an enforcement of European culture, religion, weapons, also diseases, economic, political systems all around the world that permanently changed societies around the world. A lot of countries, continents worked in very different ways before the European invasions came. And this had a massive impact on all of these areas of life. The whole world also became connected through trade, right? Because you started having trade of resources, often of stolen resources. You started having slave trade, which unfortunately is also a type of trade. And you started having connections between Europe, between the African continent, between the American continent. So you started increasingly have connections, and the spread of trade, of movement of people, a spread of diseases as well, a spread of cultural influences. So this is really where globalization started off. And as a result, you also had European states accumulating incredible amounts of wealth. Because of all the stolen resources, because of all the conquered territories, because of the exploitation of slave labor. So this also set European states into a position of advantage in the race around globalization that came later, right? On the other hand, you also had European societies starting to be partly influenced by the encounter with other cultures, right? So there was also diversification in terms of culture. So now these are sort of really core effects that sort of laid the ground for an increasingly globalized world, right? So this is very important to know and to understand. Now, if we look at it from a more economic side, another really important factor, according to Matzlisch, that really pushed globalization is the emergence of capitalism, right? And this is, you might have heard about this in economics classes, in other units, but one of the core concepts was introduced by Adam Smith, which was the idea of a free market and of the invisible hand, and also the concept of division of labor, which altogether promised huge increases in production and profit, right? that were only limited by the extent of the market. So basically the idea was, the invisible hand, the idea was literally that the market regulates itself. So that if somewhere you have resources, then labor will move there because there will be a need of labor. If something is valuable, the price will go up, and therefore it will become more rare. So all of these sort of economic, what can we call them, sort of economic systems, and that they would sort of balance themselves out, right? And the division of labor was the idea that you can produce much faster if you don't have one person, let's say, building a whole car, but you have 100 people and they just do a small part of the labor. So one person will only, I don't know, do the wheel. I don't know enough about cars. Car was not a good example, but I think you get the idea, right? And we see this nowadays in like in the production of technology, for example, where especially in Chinese factories, where you see that one person only does one small movement 100 times or 1,000,000 times a day, and then the next person does the next step. So Adam Smith was the one who came up with this idea, realizing that it would make the process of production much, much faster, right? Now, this whole concept basically said that you could increase your production and your profit more and more and more, and that the only limit was the market. The only limit was the amount of resources that you had. And this basically led to the idea that new markets needed to be found. And if you need new markets, you need more and more and more, right? Which really made capitalism drive globalization, because companies started to need more resources, more workers, more everything in order to produce more, in order to increase more profit. Now, on the other hand, and this is quite funny because Adam Smith was very much on the capitalist side so he was really promoting capitalist ideas, and he sort of predicted that globalization had to happen because new markets needed to be found. On the very opposite political spectrum, you had Karl Marx, who was obviously one of the biggest representatives of communist ideas. But he basically already back then predicted that capitalism would devour the world because it constantly needed to expand in order to survive. So it's quite interesting because Adam Smith and Marx had very opposite views of capitalism, one being a promoter of it and the other one being a harsh critique of it. But they both predicted that capitalism would lead to a global expansion of markets and that it would lead to a globalized world. So as you can see, this was already in 1700 and 1800, right? So it's a while ago. Now, as a result of basically all of that, right? And this is still according to Matzlisch, so you can read up more details in the text, in Matzlisch's text under week 1, if you want to understand it more in detail. But basically globalization today is characterized by the following aspects, right? One of them is that nation states are now losing their power as primary actors. So in the beginning, when the nation state was born, when we had the merchant empires and they started colonizing the world, nation states were pretty much the most important actors, right? Because they were deciding trade, they were deciding movement of people, they were deciding pretty much everything. But nowadays, we have more and more new actors emerging and becoming increasingly powerful, which makes nation states lose some of their power as primary actors, right? Which leads us to the second aspect. Like there's several new actors that are emerging or that have been emerging and that are becoming increasingly more powerful. One of them are multinational corporations. There are currently over 65,000 multinational corporations globally, and many of them are wealthier than nation states. So many of them are wealthier than small countries. So for example, a Nestle has more wealth than, I don't know, Zimbabwe or whatever country, Malawi, any small country, Mozambique. Which obviously changes the power dynamics completely, right? Because all of a sudden you have a corporation that in terms of wealth is much more powerful than certain countries where they function in, right? You also have more and more non-governmental organizations and social movements that are often international and connected across borders. And there can sometimes also be a threat to a nation state, because a government might want to impose certain things, and you have social movements that are actually strong enough to limit certain policies, often for the better. This does not necessarily have to be something negative, but it is a different power balance than what used to be. And a third one are international communication networks that have more and more power as well, because they move the information, which then influences decision making all around the world. And a third aspect that is very important, and that characterizes today's globalization to a very high degree, is the fact that problems are of more global character and cannot be addressed by one state anymore. Like we have problems like climate change that cannot be addressed by one country, even a big country that is a big polluter like China or like the US. It's not enough if that country alone takes measures. There is a need for global action. Same when it comes to international crime, to human trafficking. One country alone cannot stop or fight those problems anymore, which leads to a need of a much different international collaboration than what was back in the days. So these are really three important factors of that sort of characterize globalization nowadays. Now, there's different concepts also with regards to what drives globalization, right? One, we sort of looked at this. One of them is considered to be capitalism and multinational companies, right? Because they have been expanding, the free market has led to a need of companies growing, companies accessing more and more resources, companies being able to produce in countries where labor is cheaper. So there's sort of one current of academics that argues that capitalism and the expansion of multinational companies has been the main driving force of globalization, which is sort of a materialistic explanation, right? There's other academics that argue that it's rather ideas, information, and knowledge that have been driving globalization and the exchange of ideas, information, and knowledge, which is a more idealistic explanation, right? So you have sort of these two counterparts. Obviously, they don't exclude each other, and one could also argue that they have both been driving globalization and still are driving globalization. But it is sort of different currents amongst academics that analyze globalization. Now, when we look at different types of globalization, another distinction is made between globalization, and it sort of links to the previous one, right? Between globalization from above and globalization from below. Now, this distinction is basically made, globalization from above is seen as globalization that is created and controlled by wealthy elites, by multinational corporations. So it's basically the market-driven globalization, right? Which benefits a few powerful states, a few powerful multinational corporates and individuals. And we see quite a lot of evidence in the world of this, right? I mean, we see a few big or a few powerful countries controlling a vast amount of the world and of international trade. We see a few multinational corporates that have an immense amount of wealth, that have an immense amount of power. And we also see a few rich individuals that have very powerful positions in the world, right? So this is one way of seeing globalization, that it's really driven by economics and by the wealthy elites and the multinational corporations. There is sort of the counterpart, which is globalization from below. This type of globalization is like constituted by social movements, by minority groups who are fighting for social justice, for democratization of global processes, right? This is also called alter globalization, and we will look at it in I think in week 11, when we look at the backlash against globalization. So there's also this form of globalization, because social movements have also become more and more international, and minority groups have also become more and more connected in terms of information, in terms of communication, right? And often the fight for social justice has also become more internationalized and more globalized. So these are sort of two forms of globalization that are happening at the same time that we can see evidence of in the world, and that obviously often clash, right? Because the interests that they have are very opposed. And we can discuss this in the on the Zoom call next week, Wednesday. But try think of it already so that you can prepare to the session. So basically the question is, can you think of examples or cases where globalization from above and globalization from below have clashed? Can you think of examples in the current world or a few years ago? And also, what do you think globalization from below, what role do you think it can have or it should have? So this as a quick activity on the side, we will discuss this on the Zoom call as a group. Now, we've looked at globalization, we've looked at its origins, we've looked at different ways or different types of globalization. Now, obviously, there is a lot of criticism to globalization as well. And it's very different types of criticisms that come from very different corners, from very different people. So there's some academics that argue that there is no globalization, and other that argue that it's nothing new, that it's just something that has always been there and that is more extreme now. So these are some of the arguments of people who are critiques to globalization. One of the main arguments is that vast parts of the world's population are not actually globalized yet or are not part of the process. You can think of any rural area in any country that is not necessarily connected to the internet, that might not even be on the grid, that doesn't have an airport close by. Those areas, although they exist in a globalized world, they're not actually part of globalization. And those areas are actually still a majority. So the question is, can we talk of a globalized world if actually vast parts of the world's population is not part of it? So this is one of the arguments against globalization, that says globalization is actually not as global as we say it is. Another argument is that globalization is only a new term for an ancient process. So this pretty much links to Chanda, to the fact that as humans we've always been expanding and looking for more, and so therefore there is this argument that says it's always been like that. It's just sort of at a stronger level now than what it was 1,000 years ago. But even 1,000 years ago, people would go and look for new territories. Another argument is that the nation state is actually regaining importance, and these are people that say that look at countries, for example, like the United States, that is increasingly closing its borders more or making stronger border policies. You have increasing talk of building walls, or you have nation states exiting international agreements. So there's basically this argument that there is evidence that nation states are trying to get more power back, and that this goes against globalization, that we have more and more states that sort of want to isolate more again, and that this is actually a counter-trend to globalization. So that's also an argument that is there. Another argument says that multinational corporations are actually not as global as we say, that they usually just function in a few countries and not on a global level. Another argument says that relationships between governments are still mostly bilateral. So for example, South Africa having an agreement, technological agreement with the government of Germany, for example, and that it's not necessarily multilateral relationships. And then there's also people who completely reject the idea of a global culture or of a globalized culture. And this is something we'll look at in week 3 when we look at the globalization of culture. So this is some of the criticism towards the concept or the understanding of globalization that is currently out there. Here as well, question: do you agree? Do you disagree? Which arguments make sense to you? Which ones do you think are rather weak arguments? also something to discuss. Now, talking about criticism to globalization, we have to talk about Noam Chomsky, because he's one of the main critiques. He is a US linguist, philosopher, historian, and activist. He's a very important personality in the US, but also globally, because he has been a very loud voice. He's someone who is not opposed to globalization itself, but he specifically denounces the current economic neoliberal globalization, because he says, rightly so, that it is dominated by the US and its economic interests. And what he argues is that the current neoliberal globalization is not benefiting the masses. So he disagrees with this idea of a rising sea raises all boats, which was the idea that if we create more wealth, then everybody is better off. He says, no, that's not the case, because wealth is being monopolized by a few individuals, and the rest is actually not getting more wealthy, but rather poorer. He's also saying that the current globalization is leading to greater inequality, and there is a lot of evidence in numbers for that. And what he also argues is that current neoliberal globalization is not beneficial for democracy, because he basically says that multinational corporations have become too strong and are therefore able to corrupt state leaders, and that there is too much of an interlinkage between corporates and state leaders, which negatively affects democracy. So this is also one of the very important criticism. In this specific case, he doesn't criticize globalization itself. He criticizes the way globalization is happening nowadays, or the type of globalization that is happening. And we will look at neoliberal globalization next week when we look at economic globalization. So don't worry if you're not fully understanding what it means, because you definitely will by next week. Now, last but not least, we've touched on a few of them indirectly already. There's a lot of processes that are related or that are linked to globalization, or that have somehow helped driving globalization, right? And that link to different parts, either to more economic globalization or to more cultural globalization. These are a few of them. And the question is really, how are these processes linked to each other, and how did they influence globalization, or still do? You can read up on each of them in your textbook in chapter 3. But just quickly, we touched on imperialism, right? Which is basically what led European powers to colonize the world, which then led to colonialism. The difference is really that imperialism was more trade-oriented, while colonialism really then focused on really possessing those territories, right, and really establishing themselves there as well. We have what is called post-colonialism, which is basically what remains, sort of the remainders, the structural remainders of colonialism, which are still present in the countries, be it in terms of economic structures, in terms of financial institution structures. We have what we call neocolonialism, which is usually sort of the ongoing, sort of more hidden economic influence, or still type of colonialism. Also the still ongoing military presence of ex-colonial powers. For example, France still has a lot of military bases in many African countries. So these are all processes that are linked to globalization and that have in one way or another influenced, or still do. Development is a period in time in the 70s and 80s, where a lot of Western countries started sort of promoting developmental programs in ex-colonies that were often linked to structural adjustments. We will talk about this when we look at the economic globalization as well. And this had quite an influence on how ex-colonies sort of what economic structures they adopted, and how they function today. So we'll look at that as well, because it's more economic related. And then we also have terms like Westernization, Americanization, and Easternization that relate more to culture and to how the culture of countries, particularly of colonized parts of the world, has been influenced by the Western nation that colonized them, but also later by America and just its international influence. Easternization refers to the sort of to the cultural influence of more Eastern nations like China, like South Korea, like Japan, that have also started influencing cultures in other countries. So this just as a side note, so that you're aware that there is a link to all of these processes as well. As I said, you can find more information in chapter 3 on each one of them, and also on how they link to each other and to globalization. This is basically it for today's lecture. I don't want to give you more content because I think it's already quite a lot and it's quite a lot of theory. So please make sure you read the chapters. Like this lecture was based on chapter 1 and chapter 2 of the textbook. So you can find more information there, more in detail as well. And then please complete the week 1 activity. It will be posted separately in a video as well. And then next week, Wednesday, as I said, we will do a Zoom call to debrief. We'll discuss some of the questions that we touched on now in the lecture. We will debrief on the political orientation quiz. We will do that in a Zoom call, also in small group discussions in breakaway groups and with me. And then next week, we will have the online lecture on economic globalization. That one is based on chapters 4, 6, and 7 in the book. So it's quite a lot of reading that goes into that one. Economic globalization, you've probably already seen it a bit, is pretty much what drives current globalization. So it is probably the most important lecture and really the one that you really need to understand, because it influences pretty much everything else. So make sure you come well prepared and that you watch it. Also, if you have questions, if there's things that are unclear, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Send me an email, ask for an individual consultation. It's very different to have these lectures all online because I can't see your reaction. I don't see feedback. I don't see, was it clear, was it not? So I cannot adapt the pace to you. So if it's too fast, if it's too much, or if it's too slow, too little, let me know, because I can adapt, because this is for you. So let me know. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you next week.